Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. How are you? Glad you're here. Hope you had a great weekend. Welcome back to another week of nobody has any idea what's going on. But we're doing the best we can to make sense of it here. And I'm glad you're with us for this process here. So here's the plan today. I want to do a very quick segment here, say a couple things about the virus that I think we need to we've learned and kind of keep in mind as we move forward for the week. Then I want to talk about China and the WUHAN Institute of Virology and where this darn thing came from. We're going to have a guest to talk about China's ambitions to take over the world and what we need to do about that moving forward. And then we'll wrap up with a segment about the difference between a fear mindset, a learning mindset, and a growth mindset in the midst of all of this. So that's the plan. Glad you're here. Let's do this. First thing, be very careful of making conclusions based off of headlines. When we have a minute to breathe, we'll do a segment on this, on how to become a Zen, and I'm not, by the way, I'm not this, but we need to become a Zen Jedi master when it comes to reading headlines, who not only can determine when a headline is clickbait or not, or wrong and inaccurate, but to not get swayed by them, to not make any conclusion or judgment based off the headline. And we all do it. It's so hard not to. You read a headline and you're like, boom, you just go right to wherever you want to go with it. And you're already influenced before you even read the story. We almost have to you have to read the headline and just think nothing. It's really, really hard to do it. So I'll give you an example. So it's the headline here in The Spectator. Stanford study suggests coronavirus is more widespread than realized. Now, my initial thought is, because I want this thing to be over, I don't want to be doing this virus thing anymore. So my immediate thought was hopeful. I was like, oh, great. 80% of people have already had the virus, which is good, right? It already swept through America before we even realized it, which means it's not nearly as deadly, and it means we're almost done because everyone's going to be having antibodies for it, and we're home free. Hooray! And that headline and that bunch of articles like that, ABC News had one, a bunch of other, spread all over the place. I saw that headline 100 times. But if you read the story, you find out that the study that they did this, they concluded that they got the headline based off of, they checked the antibodies of 3,000 people from Santa Clara, California, right? 3,000 people. And they found out that 1.5% of people, 1.5%. And then they did some adjusting for sample size and all these other things. And they concluded that 2.8% of people in Santa Clara, California had the virus. And the headline is more widespread than realized. 2.8? And technically they're right. So it's a county of 2 million, okay? So at the time, they thought there were, the study was done in April 5th or something like that. At the time, there were 1,000 cases. And now they're saying, well, maybe as high as 50,000 cases. There's a range for what they think. So maybe 50,000 people might have had this disease. And yeah, that's more widespread than previously thought, even though we knew testing was wildly inadequate and we knew that the testing was only a small percentage of the people who actually had it. But okay, sure, so you thought there were 50,000, you think maybe there's 50,000, it's more widespread, but still that's 3%, 3 or 4% of people. There's still a lot more people to go. There's a lot more people who are still at risk for infection. 97.2% of people. And also, this is just one county in one state in the country. So listen, I know a lot of people think this is overblown, and maybe it is. Hope it is. That's fine. And I'm grateful, right? A lot of people saying, oh, it's not as deadly as people think it is. Again, great. And I'm grateful that this isn't the plague where you get it and you die 2 days later. But we've had 40,000 deaths. We're not done yet. And we're looking at that county, Santa Clara County, that was hit pretty hard very early on. Stanford's there. And they think maybe only 3% of people have it? 4%? Let's go crazy. Say 5% of people. There's still ways to go. And I think we forgot about this reality over the last couple weeks. And I hate to be the one to remind us. But the point of flattening the curve wasn't to get rid of the virus. It was to slow its spread over a long enough period of time to keep us under that healthcare line. And we're way under that healthcare line. Remember that there was a lot of panic and outrage about, I saw this fly in here, by the way, this weekend. And I was like, that fly is gonna come back and haunt me. I couldn't get it, and it just went in my mouth. Remember there was all this panic, like we're gonna go over the line. All these people are gonna die because we're way over the line. Amen, we weren't anywhere near over the line for most of the country, maybe New York, but nowhere else around the country. That's awesome, it's great. But the same number of people are still gonna get the thing. The point was flattening the curve, buy us some time, maybe we get some treatments and cures, eventually a vaccine. But in the meantime, people are still gonna get it. Now again, good news, it's not the plague. You're not gonna instantly die when you do. It doesn't kill everyone it touches, but you're probably still gonna get this thing at some point. We're not done. We're not done with it. This is a doctor, he researches population health, whatever that is, at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. And he's talking about those curves we've seen, the model curves, right? This article, this interview is from March 11th, right? So it was over a month ago, and I bring that up. It's important that this is on March 11th to remind us that of this point that I think I have forgotten about. So he uses this analogy of a subway car, right? So the peak curve that we've all seen a million times. He said, think of that as people who want to get on a subway. And the healthcare system, its capacity is the subway car. And everyone who's sick there are people on the platform and they want to get into the subway car to get well. Here's what he said. He said, this is what he said back on March 11th. He said, there's just not enough room in the car to take care of everybody, to accommodate everybody. That's the first curve, if you will, the big peak one. That's the system that's overwhelmed. It just can't handle it. And people wind up not getting the services that they need. But if we instead spread out those cases so that everybody on the subway car who's sick doesn't show up at the same time, but instead shows up at different times, then that subway car can accommodate the right number of people, but over a longer period of time. That makes sense. We've heard that a million times. But the NPR reporter asked a really good question, and good for her. She said, okay, but to take your metaphor of the subway car one step further, you're assuming that with this flatter curve, that people will still need to get on the subway. In other words, you're assuming that we're not going to see a quick end to the spread of coronavirus, that people will still continue to get affected. And this guy said, oh, yeah. He said, just today, Angela Merkel announced that they're expecting between 60 and 70% of the Germans will be getting the virus. But if they all come down with it at the same time, the net system is overwhelmed. I remember when Angela Merkel said that. I distinctly remember that. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, said the same thing. He said it's about 70% of Californians are going to get it. And I remember when he first said that, big headlines on Drudge, and people freaked out because it's a big dramatic number. And it's easy to look at it now and be like, oh, well, 70% of people didn't get this. He was way overblown, right? Like our hospitals are fine. A lot of hospitals are empty, even in California. But I don't know what he actually said. Speaking of headlines, I don't really know what Governor Newsom said back weeks ago about 70%. I don't know what he meant by that number. I don't know if he said 70% of the people are going to get it tomorrow, or eventually 70% of people are going to get it. But I still think it's true that eventually about 70% of people over a long enough time are going to get it. Does that mean 70% are going to die? No. But going to get it. All we're doing now is delaying the infection, praying it's not serious, and making sure we have proper treatments for people who do need it. But we're just buying time. So I don't know, do whatever you want with that. But I realized that again this weekend. I was like, oh, we're not done. It's not like the virus is gone all of a sudden. I'll end with this real quick because I want to get to our China stuff. But this is Kathy O'Neill. She wrote a good article the other day. She said, this isn't the flattened curve that we were promised. So every graph we've ever seen shows a symmetrical bell curve. So let's say it rises up for 2 weeks and then has a peak and then it falls down for the next 2 weeks, the same way it fell up, so it's symmetrical. So now we have a little more data and a little more reflection of reality. Can we show the first graph here? I think we have New York. We have two graphs, one of New York. Yeah, this one's Italy. So see how it goes up pretty quick, but it doesn't fall down as quickly. That means you have the other one too? Same kind of deal, right? It goes up, but it doesn't fall down quite as quickly. So it's not as much of a peak as much as a plateau. And Kathy says the shape strongly suggests that the bad news won't go away nearly as quickly as it arrived. I guess the point of this is I hope this virus not as serious as we thought. I hope we could come up with good treatment to help keep people alive. Vaccine's really far away, but I hope we get one soon. I hope for the best, but we got to be prepared for it all. Even if it's a less serious disease than people told us it would be, we still got to prepare for it to go on for a long time, unfortunately. Now, in the meantime, we know who to blame, and those are the communists. We're going to talk about them coming up next. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. I want to talk about the Chi-Coms for a little bit here. Let's back it up. Occam's razor, named after some friar in the 14th century, like, I don't know, Bill Occam. Officially, the statement is, entities should not be multiplied without necessity. The simplified translation is, the simplest solution is most likely the right one. So if you're trying to find an explanation for something, shave away, razor, right? Shave away the overly complicated explanations. It's probably the more simple option. So if you have two competing explanations for the same phenomenon, take the one that has the fewest assumptions. So let's say you come home and there's a vase on the ground broken in your living room. You got a couple of different options here. Did a bird fly to your house, open the window, fly around, knock over the vase, leave, shut the window, and fly away? That's option number one. Or did your kids knock it over when they were playing Niyaki? Okay. Which explanation here assumes the least? We all do this all the time, but not all the time. We do the Occam's razor a lot, but then a lot of the time we don't. We always assume the most complicated thing. So to bring it to COVID, if we're trying to explain where this virus came from, the two explanations we have right now are a wet market in Wuhan or the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I actually think the one that assumes the least is the lab. So where'd this thing come from? First thing, we'll never know, probably. We'll probably never know. It is, my only point here, I'm not saying, I'm certain that it came from, I'm not saying that. But it is extremely possible that this thing came from a lab in Wuhan. Not, I want to be clear, not as a bioweapon designed by the Chinese to unleash upon the world purposely. That's not my point. But somehow got out as a mistake. I'm going to prove that here. Now, first, the media. We talked about this before. We're not going to do it again because we got to get going. But the media mocked and ridiculed Senator Tom Cotton as a fool for asking questions about this laboratory a couple months ago. That's just, by the way, just a few blocks from this wet market. Just mocked and ridiculed. And then later, just the other day, like last week, had to admit that the State Department had been warned about this lab twice in the past. Twice. Memos sent to the State Department saying, guys, just so you know, there's this lab in Wuhan that's doing coronavirus experiments on bats. And they're not really well equipped for this, and it might lead to global pandemic. Okay? So that's like, this is, but the media they had to throw this bioweapon thing in there to make this suggestion, this completely reasonable suggestion, some sort of wacky, crazy conspiracy theory. So when Tom Cotton brought this very reasonable thing up, the media had to be like, oh, like, can you believe Republicans think that this was a bioweapon that the Chinese created? It's like, no, that's not what we're saying here. We're saying that they're doing experiments on viruses in this lab and that pathogens actually very frequently escape from laboratories. And that may very well be what caused this, right? But you see how the media had to be like, oh, the Republican conspiracy theory, bioweapon. Like, no, that's not what we're saying. Like I got my papers all crumpled up. Just trying to make a point. This is an article from 2014. April 11th, 2014 is from the National Post by Martin Furmansky, who's a medical doctor and medical historian. He says the headline is "The Danger of a Man-Made Pandemic Sparked by a Laboratory Escape is Not Hypothetical." That's the subheadline. Not hypothetical. Now, that article is based off of a scientific article from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. So the background here is there's something called gain-of-function experiments. This is where researchers manipulate pathogen. A pathogen is anything that can cause a disease. So they purposefully manipulate pathogens to make them more deadly and more spreadable among humans. I don't know why scientists do this. Maybe there's a good reason. I think the idea is they try to make it this way so that they can like beat the virus before it naturally gets this way. I don't really know, but I'm assuming there's some explanation for why you would do a gain of this type of experiment. But the risk of these deadly strains leaving the lab is way too high, which is why in 2015, the United States stopped funding gain-of-function experiments. Now in Wuhan, in this lab, again, they studied coronaviruses in bats for the love of Pete. So let's talk about how prevalent these things leave laboratories. Because if you asked me, Slater, how often do you think a virus will leave a lab? I would say, oh, never. Like it never leaves a lab. Why, like that doesn't make any sense. Maybe once a decade a virus or disease will leave a laboratory, I guess, right? Happens all the time. So let's go through these real fast. So H1N1, it reappeared in the Soviet Union and China in 1977. They found out it was a 1950s strain that escaped a laboratory and affected a bunch of people. 1972, smallpox got into a lab assistant in London. They were working on smallpox. The lab assistant got it. She went to a hospital, and she was in a hospital bed. They didn't know what it was. She was in a hospital bed. There was someone else in the hospital room with her. 2 visitors went to go see that person. They died of smallpox. And then they were able to get it contained. No one else died. 1978, Birmingham Medical School. A woman died from smallpox. Her office was in the floor above the smallpox laboratory. So the researchers did something wrong, and then the ventilation system was broken at the same time, and it ended up killing the woman above the laboratory. There's a disease called the Venezuelan equine encephalitis. 75,000 cases, 300 deaths in Venezuela and Colombia, I think, and it escaped from an infected lab worker or a mosquito. A mosquito comes through the window, gets this disease, flies back out, bunch of people dead. SARS, 2003, check out this quote. SARS has not reemerged naturally, but there have been 6 cases from virology labs that have escaped. 1 each in Singapore and Taiwan, and 4 separate escapes in the same laboratory in Beijing, the same place. Foot and mouth disease, 2007, there was an outbreak in England. It was just 2 miles from the farm that the foot and mouth disease outbreak was 2 miles from a BSL-4 lab. That's the highest level laboratory. Investigations concluded that construction vehicles, check this out, construction vehicles carried mud contaminated with foot and mouth disease from a defective wastewater line at the laboratory to the farm. So they washed the foot and mouth disease down the drain in the lab. Something like the sewer line was broken. It somehow got in the mud, and then a construction company came and took the mud from outside the lab and moved it to a farm. I don't get that at all, but my point is like it escapes mosquitoes, people, mud, broken water lines, broken ventilation systems. Quick little anecdote here. There's one foot and mouth disease strain in the United States. It is at the U.S. Department of Agriculture Plum Island facility off of Long Island, but they've moved that center to Kansas, and it's going to open up in 2022. And people at the time thought that was a really bad idea to have these laboratory experiments about animal diseases being done in Kansas, so close to farms and actual animals, as opposed to an island off of Long Island. And they may have a case here. So this is from the National Post. This is this author. It's hardly reassuring, despite technological improvements in containment facilities, that potentially highly consequent breaches of biocontainment occur nearly daily. So again, if you ask me how often this happened, I'd say, oh, never, maybe once a decade. It happens almost daily. In 2010, 244 unintended releases of bioweapon candidate select agents were reported. 244 in a year. Looking at the problem pragmatically, the question is not if such escapes will result in a major civilian outbreak, but rather, again, this is 2014, but rather what the pathogen will be and how such an escape may be contained, if indeed it can be contained at all. 2014, this guy wasn't thinking, coronavirus. But here we are. So the media said it's impossible that this could have escaped from a lab in Wuhan. That's so ridiculous, that's absurd, you stupid conspiracy theory nut job Republicans. No. It is entirely possible. It actually happens quite often. And it was just a matter of time before it was going to be a more deadly strain. I gotta go here because I want to go to our guest here. Let me share one more. This is from another academic science article. The consequences of a lab escape of a potential pandemic pathogen. This is also in 2014. Now is the time to address the next critical question. What is the likelihood that one of these viruses will escape a lab and seed the very pandemic that researchers claim they're trying to prevent? Again, the gain-of-function experiments they're trying to prevent, but what are the chances that in the process it actually causes a pandemic? As we shall estimate, that probability could be as high as 27%, a risk too dangerous to live with. So that was in 2014. This is not a crazy concept. We're going to talk on tomorrow's show, we're going to talk with Stephen Mosher. He wrote a New York Post article about this on February 22nd. And the article was called "Don't Buy China's Story, the Coronavirus May Have Leaked from a Lab." This article, if you shared it on Facebook or Twitter, they banned it. They would not let you share this article from the New York Post on Facebook or Twitter a couple weeks ago. I don't know if they'll let you do it now. But check out this gem of a line. I'll end here. Stephen Mosher, we're going to talk to him tomorrow. He said, and then there's this little known fact. Some Chinese researchers are in the habit of selling their laboratory animals to street vendors after they're finished experimenting with them. You heard me right. Instead of properly disposing of infected animals by cremation, they sell them on the side to make a little extra cash, or in some cases, a lot of extra cash. One Beijing researcher now in jail made $1 million selling his monkey and rats on the live animal market, where they eventually wound up in someone's stomach. All right? They got the Joe Exotic of Wuhan out there selling infected animals. Now, apparently, they say they didn't sell bats at this market, and they say that the first people who were sick never even went to this wet market. But maybe they bought an infected bat from the janitor of the Wuhan lab so they could go home and make homemade bat soup. I don't know. We'll never know. But I think we can conclude that we don't want the communists in China to have any more power over the world, because it definitely came from there. We know that. Let's talk about China and their global ambitions, the Belt and Road Initiative. Coming up next. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. So I believe the biggest geopolitical topic that we need to focus on is us in China, specifically China's Belt and Road Initiative. Last week, we talked about China's Health Silk Road as just one aspect of their Belt and Road Initiative, and just in general, China's effort to, I don't want to say take over the world. That's a little dramatic of a sentence, but maybe not. Definitely to make the 21st century a China-centric world. That's fair. I want to talk to CLAUDIA ROSETT. She's from the Independent Women's Forum. She was a former member of the editorial board in the Wall Street Journal and editorial page editor of the Asian Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong, and has been focused a lot recently on the Hong Kong protests, which is something that we've forgotten about here in America because we're so short-sighted. CLAUDIA, how are you? Wonderful to talk to you again.
I'm fine, thank you. Great to see you.
So take over the world. Help me, my talk radio dramatic is oh, they want to take over the world. Help me temper that back a little bit to what you think is more accurate.
Well, I don't think that would actually be responsible of me. I think you're accurate. It sounds very dramatic. And the way that China puts this is they want to be sort of the dominant power, that they will be the center of things. But what they're talking about is taking over the world. Is basically transforming the rest of the planet into vassal states, which will do things only with the say-so of China. It's extremely ambitious, but it's not the first time in history that a ruthless dictator with a sort of horrible military machine at his command has set out to do something like this. And if you look at how Xi Jinping has been piecing together the pieces, that's where this heads. That is the ambition. So I don't think you should temper that. I mean, you should explain it, which is what we want to do here, but don't temper it. It's accurate.
Fair. Can you help us understand China and maybe the leaders of China, or at least propaganda, their belief that they are the center of the world, or like the chosen people, or is there any ideology behind this that's driving it?
Yeah, look, this is sort of the monstrous spawn of communism of the last century. That's where it began. And this is had China not gone that way, I think we'd be seeing a magnificent modern nation in what is China right now. Unfortunately, they followed the Soviet model. They completely embraced the Maoist version of communism. This beggared China during Mao's time. And then they began these reforms. And the great hope was that they would evolve, sort of like Taiwan went from a dictatorship to a democracy, a Chinese democracy. The hope that was China would take a similar path. The problem is it's basically a communist party with an extremely powerful structure, a Leninist structure, that's really hard to take apart. I mean, these things either collapse generally or they carry on. And in China's case, they harnessed it to a freer economy, but not to a freer polity, and carried on. And this has produced this really monstrous rise of a system that's where you have just over 90 million members of the Communist Party. They dominate a country of some 1.4 billion people, whom they regard as sort of they treat, I don't know how they regard them, but I know how they treat them, as cogs, as serfs, as slaves, basically, in the machine for enhancing their wealth and power. And there's sort of no borders to this. In the last century, communism was supposed to have no frontiers. They've sort of carried on with that same approach, in part because when you create a system like this, you need to keep feeding it. It makes people quite unhappy. So you need to constantly be expanding, acquiring more resources. That's the drive. That's what we're seeing in China. So it's not communist anymore. It's economically more efficient than that. But the aspirations and the ruthless, sort of soul-crushing nature of it, that's the same.
And I agree with all that, obviously, do the aspirations go even further back than Mao and communism? Do they go back thousands of years even in the Chinese psyche and culture at all? Or is it more of a recent phenomenon?
I think, yeah, in that sense, probably not more than for any of us. Periodically, people emerge. Look what happened with the Mongols. Mongolia is now a landlocked country in between Russia and China, sort of just trying to get along. And look what happened in Germany. Look what happened in Japan. So I don't think that this is something where Chinese culture just makes them do this. I actually think, again, look at Taiwan. Chinese culture can do wonderful things. I think that this is a sort of horrible melding of a Leninist sort of controlling structure melded onto Chinese culture. It's a sort of adapts, and in a way, this virus
is quite stable.
Yeah, it's a virus.
Yeah. Wow. We both hit that at the same time. Yeah. Whoa. What a great way to think about it. Unfortunately. Your time is precious, and I don't want to waste it with intro stuff. We've done, I think, a basic intro into the Belt and Road Initiative on the show. So I want to ask you for like second level. We did Belt and Road Initiative 101. So let's do course 201 with you for a few minutes here. What are the most important things that we need to keep an eye out on for the Belt and Road Initiative?
You need to watch for on several levels. On the military level, they have been expanding along their Belt and Road, which is Xi Jinping's initiative it's supposed to be this great bringing together of everybody. Actually, what it is turning China into the great hub and bring her together. And they've been setting up places that they potentially can be used as military bases. Future conflict arises. This is all sort of long-term planning. But along this road, sort of down from China on the way to Europe, this whole chain of places and into Africa. The thing that they've been doing to date is what's called debt diplomacy, where they offer loans to countries. Sri Lanka is the usual example, and it's a good one, where they offer loans to develop a port. And Sri Lanka says, yeah, great, that sounds wonderful, and then gets in over its head. And then China does a swap of debt for equity, and they take ownership of this thing in another country. And that's their approach. It's a very predatory approach in one place after another. They're in trouble on this right now. But what they do over and over is it goes back to this sort of whole thing that you keep hearing China calling for solidarity and unity. actually the free world kind of runs on competition. And what China tries to do is bring everybody under this sort of sway of the Communist Party, where they're in debt, or they depend on China for providing them with crucial services. We've seen this happen in America. We're not part of the Belt and Road, but with medicine, where suddenly we discover, my gosh, China now controls the supplies of critical medicine and pharmaceutical components, even things that India needs to manufacture for us. So that's the Belt and Road. And it's all framed as this wonderful development thing, get in on the Marco Polo comes to the 21st century. It's not. It's a predatory, invasive thing. And the problem is, it's not as if you have private companies in China making individual investments. Yeah, I'd say, okay. But they are all answerable and controlled by the Communist Party in China. So there's a unified strategy behind it.
Perfectly said. So if let's take it down let's go down a couple, years, decades, whatever. So let's say China builds all these ports in East Africa or in the Middle East, right? And then they could take ownership of them. Then what? Are they able to leverage their power? Are they able to do they use do they take over the local currency? Do they institute their institutions, their political ideologies? What's the next step of it?
Yeah, we've seen it already remember what happened with the National Basketball Association last fall? You do something they don't like, they punish you because you have you're connected with them financially, economically. For currencies, they would like their currency to be the world's reserve currency. Right now, it's not even something they operate in dollars. So they would be very happy to see that change. They keep looking for openings for that. How else would they use it? Once you have control of, say, ports, you control trade. You can say, no, this goes through or this doesn't. This gets held up. We're going to tax this. We won't tax that. So you have a potential chokehold on trade, which if you have simple for-profit motivations, again, of, say, private players, you can sort of say, oh, well, they'll keep doing business. But when it's a unified strategy, tracking back to Beijing can sort of target, and over again, like the NBA, they target one thing, and that thing just can't fight back, whether it's a person, a business, a country in some cases, against the heft of China. As long as they act together, which is what the Communist Party is basically about there. It's, that unified glob that pretends to speak for 1.4 billion people, even though there are a lot of those 1.4 billion people who would really like to speak for themselves, but get disappeared or punished if they do. So that's where, as China comes to control more and more of that, you aren't dealing any longer with sort of individual ports where if one place isn't working, you can go to another, or you sort of have options. It's all the company's store. That gives enormous control. And as soon as China has enormous control, what you see is they start telling people, don't criticize us, don't do anything we don't like, march to our tune, pay us tribute. That's what's happening in Hong Kong now.
The NBA was such an illustrative example, and I'm sure you noticed it right away, and we commented on it, but I don't think we knew we didn't use it I didn't see it as a foreshadowing moment or example of what's going on all around the world as well, because we're no better in America. We have fallen for this just as Sri Lanka and all these other countries have. So I want to get to Hong Kong in a second. We got 3 minutes, but are you surprised that the WHO has fallen in line with the Chinese government with all this?
No. One of the other things that China has done is study the United Nations and look for ways to exploit it. And the UN just lends itself to that kind of thing. It's this huge collective where the US is, occasionally with Britain, is really the only country that tries to enforce integrity or reform at the UN. Everybody else just uses it. And China has used it very effectively and now controls a whole number of agencies. And they had their person running the WHO for 10 years, from 2007 to 17, Margaret Chan from Hong Kong. Hong Kong is full of freedom-loving people, but its government is anointed by Beijing, and they put her forward, okay? She was condemned by Hong Kong's legislature for bungling the early phase of SARS in 2003. Nonetheless, she was elected to the WHO. She's who preceded the current Director General, Dr. Tedros of Ethiopia. And China has basically colonized the WHO. It is part, again, along with the Belt and Road, it's part of targeting sort of infrastructure in many ways, in this case, diplomatic, where China gets enormous influence. In fact, what's happened with money, China pays like a tenth of what America has been paying until President Trump suspended funding last week. But what we give to these agencies at the UN, they tend to regard as an entitlement. You know, that's just what America gives. It's automatic, it's expected. China comes in and sort of gives bits at the margin and then demands things. Also, China does not have the kind of objection at highest levels to corruption that we do. They have no free press that can expose this. So while I'm not implying anything about the World Health Organization in particular here, I do think it's quite fair to say that China has a lot more latitude, should anyone there choose to bribe officials.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, can you give us the very quick, you were just on the phone with someone in Hong Kong. What's the latest there? Because Western media, we've forgotten about that whole thing by now.
These are such brave people, and the times are really hard. They had these huge protests last year to try and stop China from taking away their rule of law, basically, from extraditing them to China. And over and over, these huge marches. This year, that has now run into the coronavirus. So they've now got a quarantine on Hong Kong where actually all foreigners are banned from coming in. Only residents can fly into Hong Kong right now because of the virus. So, and they are doing the same kinds of things that we've been doing, the social distancing, they're out and about more, but everybody's going around in face masks. Everybody's trying to be careful. Any gathering, I think, of more than 4 people is banned. So putting together a 1 million-person march, as they did last year, has become incredibly difficult. I don't see how they can do it. At the same time, they won't knuckle under. These are people who really want the freedoms that China promised them under treaty and has been taking away. And we just had this sweeping arrest of more than a dozen of their most prominent democracy activists, really brave people who stood up. Jimmy Lai, Martin Lee, people well known if you follow that part of the world. And it's a warning. China has set a new commissar down there, the head of the China Liaison Office, which is Beijing's highest authority in Hong Kong. And he is calling for sedition laws to be put in. This has been a controversy for years, but he's now saying this must happen. They just had something called, brace yourself, National Security Education Day in Hong Kong. This is a modern city full of people who understand how democracy works, what sort of real values of transparency, free speech, and so on involve. And they're just being engulfed in this Chinese...
And the world is distracted. Claudia, I hate we got to run. Thank you so much. I hope we can talk again because, like I said, I think this is the most important thing worldwide going on. So thanks for being our expert.
I would be glad to. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Claudia ROSETT from the Independent Women's Forum, among other places. Okay, we'll wrap up on a positive note. Next, we'll talk about growth mindset. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. All right, Slater Crusaders, now that we're done talking about how China is going to take over the world, and if we ever say anything about it, they're going to take away all our antibiotics, which is just great. Let's kind of end on a good note here. So I came across this letter from W.E.B. Du Bois sent to his daughter, a bunch of advice. And one day we'll get to the whole thing because it's all perfect. But for now, I just want to leave you with this line. He said to his daughter, take yourself in hand and master yourself. Make yourself do unpleasant things so as to gain the upper hand of your soul. Take yourself in hand and master yourself. Rob Henderson the other day, one of our friends on the show, love Rob, we should talk to him again. He's a great newsletter, you should sign up for it. He tweeted out this quote. He said, every choice you make influences your identity and not the other way around. And the sooner you can accept this, the sooner you can become the person you want to be. You get to pick who you are. Go pick. Let me read that opening line again. Every choice you make influences your identity, not the other way around. It's not that your identity influences your choices. Your choices influence and make your identity. So you, in the midst of this, whatever this is, this COVID thing, you get to still pick who you are. That's always been true, but it's also true now. You can take yourself in hand and master yourself during this time. Or you can just be at the whims of it all and be tossed around like a little boat in the ocean, and you're just whipped around like chaff and totally out of control. You can do that if you want to. Now, obviously, listen, there's personalities and there's defense mechanisms we all have that we've built up for a long time, and we need to work on things. It may take harder for some people than others to do other, yes, there's all these variables at play. But still, in the end, you get to pick who you are. So go and pick. If you think that's true, I came across this chart, and I think it's helpful. So the question is, who do I want to be during COVID-19? So you have three zones. You have the fear zone, the learning zone, and the growth zone. Can you see that there on the screen? Is that okay? Let me read these quick. The fear zone, you hoard things that you don't need. I complain all the time. I transmit my anger and fear to others. And also I forward all messages to others. I'll explain that one in a second. That's the fear zone. We don't want to be there, that's bad. Learning zone. I stop compulsively consuming things that harm me, from food to news. I hope you're not obsessed with news. I hope you're a curator of news and you decide where to get it, and the mainstream media is not worth your time, and you've decided to spend time here on The First because we do a better job of presenting it than the lamestream. I hope you've come to that conclusion, or whatever conclusion you want to, about how to best curate news for your soul. I start letting go of things that are out of my control. We talked about anxiety. Anxiety is when you focus on things that you can't control. So you start letting go of those things. I identify my emotions. I make myself aware of the situation and think about the best way to act. Gosh, we do that here all the time. That's why we have former Navy SEALs on to tell us to calm down, focus, see what's happening, and then make the best decisions moving forward. I verify information before I share it. That's what that means, as opposed to forward all messages to others. I verify it before I send it around. We did that in the first segment of the show. And I acknowledge that everyone's trying their best. We did this from the jump. Grace, 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 grace has to be the name of the game. You got to give grace to everybody, including yourself. And we acknowledge that everybody's trying their best throughout this time. That's good. Learning zone. It's good to be there. If you're there, I'm grateful. Growth zone is where we want to be. Find a purpose. I think of how I can help others. I use my skills to service the ones in need. I show empathy to others. I live in the present, focus in the future. I keep myself emotionally happy, and I transmit hope. I show gratefulness. We try to do that every day. I find ways to adapt to change, and I practice calmness, patience. I focus on creativity, and I focus on relationships. Okay, we tweeted that out. Slater Radio on Twitter. You can see that yourself. I'm reading the growth zone. It's like, geez, that's obviously where I want to be. I feel peace even just reading them, let alone being them. I'm not that, but just reading it makes me feel good. On our special last week, we talked to another nurse from Samaritan's Purse in Italy. Those people are in the growth zone. This is why they're so beautiful to talk to. Their compassion. If you missed it, check out this visual here. I'll never forget this story. Busy tent hospital set up, full of people. It's like 68 beds or something, full of people, plus doctors, nurses, administrators, everyone, moving fast. And I asked her, Bev is her name, I asked her how she slows down. How does everyone there slow down? How do you help people in the moment? And she said, well, we have doctors and nurses who will stop and brush the hair of older women, patients, and help them feel some dignity. One patient was dying, and the doctor was rubbing the man's feet, and a nurse learned a song in Italian and was singing it to him as he was dying. And because patients are there for weeks, the doctors and nurses, they get to know their patients. And of course, their families as well. So listen, on that one, I don't know what happened with that story. I'm making this movie up in my head, but I imagine this Italian man and the nurse, they were able to talk over a period of a couple weeks, and she found out that what his favorite song was. Or it's a song that he sang to his kids when they were growing up, or a song that his mother sang to him when he was growing up. And this nurse went out and learned it so that she could sing it to him. Are you kidding me? How beautiful is that? That nurse who did that she's not in the fear zone. She's not even living in the learning zone. She is in the growth zone. She knows her purpose. She knows how she can help others. She has maximum empathy and compassion. She transmits hope, eternal hope, because it's Samaritan's Purse. And she is calm and patient and creative and focuses on relationships. She is living in the growth zone. Look at all the beauty she's doing with it. I said, who knows how much longer this thing's going to go on? But wouldn't we all be better off working our way out of the fear zone, hanging out in the learning zone, and doing the best we can to get in that growth zone? And not just with COVID, but with everything in life. It's on our Twitter, Slater Radio. You can find it there, print it out, look at it every day. I will. True story. Mike Slater. See you tomorrow. Spread the word.